What has official history erased from the pages of time? What if you were told that the true cradle of power, the foundation of law and astronomy in the Middle East, was not born where you think, but in the heart of ancient Africa? What would change in your faith and your identity if the Bible and secret archaeology confirmed that black African kings ruled Mesopotamia? This is the secret of the lost royal line, the lineage of Cush and Nubian sovereigns that was not confined to the Nile Valley, but sat on the thrones of Akkad, and legendary Babylon. It is the story of how African wisdom created the world's first great empire, and how that legacy was stolen and disguised through centuries of distortion. On this journey, we will uncover the hidden symbols, the secret coronation ritual, the clay tablets that prove this sovereignty, and the divine clash between pantheons that resulted in the greatest erasure in human history. It is time to awaken ancestral memory and understand why the truth about the past of Cush, the land of the Black Kings, is so dangerous to modern power. But before we delve into this secret that could rewrite history, if you're feeling this connection and this thirst for ancestral knowledge, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. And tell me in the comments, from which part of the world are you hearing this sacred revelation? Prepare to rewrite the map of ancient history. In the dusty silence of millennia lies a secret capable of rewriting the genesis of civilization, a mystery as vast as the desert, the hidden presence of African sovereigns in the legendary Fertile Crescent. The chronicles carved in stone and academic texts insist on telling us a linear story, but the whispers of the ruins reveal that the cradle of royalty was not exclusively what we have been taught. Before the grand narratives took shape, dark-skinned kings erected thrones where Iraq and Syria now lie, defying the Eurocentric chronology of antiquity. The truth is that the borders we know today are merely fresh scars on the map of time, and African royalty was not confined to the Nile Valley as if they were isolated islands of power. What has been deliberately erased is the majestic lineage that not only coexisted with, but at many times presided over, the peoples who would come to be known as Babylonians and Sumerians, weaving a dark thread into the white fabric of history. This is the enigma of a forgotten sovereignty, dating back to a golden age when Africa was the undisputed center of wisdom and power. Museums display fragments of a distorted memory, but the earth holds beneath its layers the stubborn evidence, artifacts and images that do not fit into the imposed historical framework, portraying leaders with undeniably Cushite and Nilotic features and adornments. Concealing this origin is not merely a mistake, it is a fundamental suppression that distorts all understanding of the political, social, and spiritual development of humanity. The time has come to break the silence and look beyond the veil that official history has hastily placed over this ancestral royalty. The mere idea of conceiving this connection ignites the imagination and challenges the narrative that power has always flowed from north to south, or from east to west, reversing the logic of knowledge. It takes courage to accept that the roots of law, writing, and astronomy were born under the rule of kings whose heritage stretches back to the depths of the African continent. This is not a mere theory, but the revelation of a time when African spheres of influence extended for thousands of kilometers, linking the pyramids to the ziggurats. History has been a selective guardian, but the ground where these black kings walked still pulsates with the energy of their reign. The mystery that now unfolds is not about the origin of civilization, but about the whereabouts of the truth that sustained it at its peak. If African royalty ruled the centers of the Middle East, what route did they take, and what did they take with them beyond the dunes and rivers? The next secret, lying in the ancient routes of the Nile, is about to be revealed. The Nile, folks, wasn't just a river that bathed the shores of Kemet. It was the pulsating vein of power and the first transcontinental highway of the ancient world, a true artery of civilization. It extended far beyond what we imagine, connecting the heart of Africa, where the water originates, to the ports that opened onto the Red Sea and, from there, to the vastness of the Indian Ocean. This connection formed an ancestral corridor of knowledge, gold, incense, and, most importantly, of people that went far beyond the pyramids. The wisdom of the Cushites, born in what is now Sudan, and the strength of Kemet, were not confined. They traveled in sturdy boats, down the river, and then, by land or sea, followed the route eastward, towards the Tigris and Euphrates. This is not a simple trade journey, you see, but a migration of ideas, beliefs, and techniques, which fused the mysticism of the Nile with the architecture of the Mesopotamian lands. Think about it. The route of a civilization is, in fact, the route of its mysteries. This invisible bridge, paved by the spice trade and the exchange of legal codes, allowed African spirituality to disembark in the cities of Ur and Babel. Legends tell that priests from Africa were consulted by the magicians of Chaldea, and that astrology, born on the Nile, flourished in the observations of the Euphrates. It is a profound exchange where what is called the cradle of humanity actually had an older and more powerful brother to the south. This migration and trade route, linking the heart of sub-Saharan Africa to the valleys of the Middle East, was an open secret to the ancient world, but kept secret in modern history. The kings of the Nile were not turning their backs on what we call the East. They were, in fact, integrated into it, sending diplomats, architects, and yes, armies, who established alliances and, in many cases, thrones. It is no wonder that the ancient Greeks were amazed by the wealth and depth of these southern peoples. But what exactly did these sovereigns take with them that was so valuable as to guarantee them a place of power in the land of other peoples? What did the Black Kings of Cush exchange for the right to sit on the thrones of the East? The answer, perhaps, lies engraved not only in clay, but in the very foundation stone of the cities they helped to build. A mystery that takes us to the beginning of Sumerian civilization. What is known about Sumer, the place where writing and the wheel are believed to have originated, is merely the tip of a much older and deeper coin, stemming from an unexpected influence. The earliest traces of the Sumerians reveal a culture that seemed to emerge from nowhere, already possessing a complex irrigation system and a fully formed pantheon of gods. But where did all this advanced knowledge come from? Their own legends point to a people who arrived by sea, bringing the wisdom of the waters and the stars. There are archaeological findings in Ur and Uruk that subtly, yet persistently, show a visual link to Africa, mainly in the facial features and hairstyles of the oldest artifacts, which strongly resemble those of the Cushite people. The first rulers, those who erected the first ziggurats, dressed in animal skins, a ceremonial practice that echoes the royal rituals found in the depths of the Nile. This is no coincidence. Royal wisdom seemed to follow a universal code born in the south. This spiritual connection becomes even stronger when we look at Sumerian mythology, where the concept of a universe governed by cosmic justice and the importance of duality strongly resembles the principles of Ma'at from Kemet. They shared a reverence for the serpent as a symbol of wisdom and renewal, and a deep connection with the worship of water, seen as the primordial source of life. It was as if the first spiritual code of Sumeria was a dialect of African mysticism. Many historians strive to draw a dividing line between Africa and the Middle East, but the Sumerian myths themselves refuse to accept this separation, telling stories of heroes who came from distant and fertile lands. What happened was that the arrival of these Black Kings was not an invasion, but rather a fusion, where the seed of African civilization germinated on the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. It is a foundational legacy that has been conveniently left aside. So, who were these chiefs who arrived with the key to knowledge and organization? Were they mere merchants, or were they, in fact, the holders of a royal lineage that stretched for thousands of kilometers? The mystery of their identity and their arrival forces us to ask, wasn't the cradle of Sumerian civilization in reality an extension of the Nile Empire? And what does the legend in the next section reveal about the ancestor who made this journey? Every great civilization has an origin myth, but Mesopotamia's hides a surprising detail, the figure of a founder who was not from there, a true son of water, who sailed from distant lands to give form to chaos. Ancient stories speak of a powerful being who arrived as a prophecy, a bearer of fire, of knowledge, who brought with him the celestial rules to organize the world of men. He was not a mere leader, but an architect of cosmic order on Earth. This legendary figure, whose skin was like night and whose eyes were like stars, came not only with strength but with the wisdom of millennia. It is believed that he was part of a lineage of African priest kings who mastered the art of astronomy and writing, and who were sent to South civilization where there was only sand and disorder. His arrival was a landmark, for he not only united the scattered tribes but also taught them to measure time and honor the gods. The mystery is not whether he existed, but why his African origin was downplayed and then erased from official narratives. His name, which varied in each language, was always associated with the source of life, with the power that emerges from primordial waters, just as the Nile floods and brings fertility. He was the link between the mysticism of the south and the urban flourishing of the north, establishing an empire under a spiritual philosophy that valued truth and justice above all else. Legend says that upon leaving, he did not disappear. He merely returned to the source, leaving behind not only cities, but a royal code of conduct, inscribed in symbols that only the initiated could read. This code, which dictated the relationship between the king and the divine, was the true African heritage in the Middle East. His power lay not in the sword, but in the direct connection with the sacred, something that subsequent sovereigns attempted to replicate, but never equaled. If an African leader laid the foundations of all power in Mesopotamia, he certainly left visual and spiritual marks that cannot be denied. What happened to the icons and objects he used to prove his lineage and his divine right to rule? The next secret lies in the way royalty was represented in early statues and royal seals, revealing a visual heritage that has been denied to us. If history books have failed to preserve this lineage, the very artifacts kept in museums around the world whisper the truth, displaying an iconography that has been intentionally misinterpreted and, worse, ignored. Looking closely at the oldest statues, whether Sumerian or Akkadian, one notices robust facial features, full lips, and hairstyles in thick braids that scream of Nilotic or African origin. It's as if the stone refuses to lie. The adornments of these original kings and queens are also a map to Africa. They display large gold earrings, intricate beaded necklaces, and the ritualistic use of animal skins, especially leopard skin, a symbol of power and priesthood that is the hallmark of Cushite royalty. These are not random details. They are visual codes that point directly to the traditions of Nubia and the Upper Nile. This royalty knew exactly where its spiritual authority came from. The conflict here is visible and painful. Why has history refused to see what the eyes see? Simply because fitting black kings into the founding of Mesopotamia would destroy the narrative of racial supremacy that shaped the West. Most of these figures are described only as Semitic kings or of uncertain origin, in a desperate attempt to erase the color and culture that gave them power. But the truth is that the power came from the south, and they wielded it with pride. These icons, lying in dusty display cases, are proof that the first peak of Mesopotamian civilization was linked to an ancestral wisdom that revered nature and the heavens. The way these sovereigns carried themselves, the dignity and weight of their ceremonial garments, tell us that they were not simply governing, they were fulfilling a divine mandate, a direct link to the cosmic forces of Africa. But what did these kings feel was so important to take away from home? What symbols did they use that represented the very essence of their power and their connection to the sacred? The answer takes us beyond physical appearance and confronts us with the spiritual codes that united the kingdoms of the Nile with the East. If the appearance of these kings was already a mystery, the symbolism they carried was the hidden key to their power. The uraeus, the sacred serpent, and the winged solar disk, supreme emblems of African royalty. These were not mere designs. They were seals of cosmic authority, signifying that the king was protected by the gods and possessed total dominion over the cycle of life and death. It was the materialization of divine power. What is most shocking is that these symbols, or very close variations, appeared on royal seals and gates of important Mesopotamian cities, including Babylon. The serpent, which in the Nile symbolized protection and the rise of royal power, reappeared in the Euphrates with the same sacred function. It was a profound adaptation, not a superficial borrowing. This shows that Eastern kings needed the African spiritual seal to legitimize their thrones. The winged solar disk, which in Kemet represented the pharaoh's soul flying with the sun god, was transformed into an emblem of sovereignty in the Eastern kingdoms, but its essence remained unchanged. It was a silent declaration that the true light of power came from the south. This use of central symbols was a way of saying, "Our authority comes from the same ancestral source as yours." Over the centuries, these emblems were diluted, losing their explicit reference to their place of origin, but the spiritual energy remained. What began as a copy of Cushite royalty to invoke their power and prestige slowly transformed into something that history has tried to claim as purely local. But the snake and the sun hold the secret. So, to whom did this ancestral wisdom belong, so powerful that distant kingdoms needed to import it to survive? The mystery leads us to a specific people, the great navigators and warriors of Africa who settled beyond Egypt, the Cushites. They were not just neighbors, they were a dominant force that left its mark. History has made a tremendous effort to confine the Cushites, the great pyramid builders of Nubia and Sudan, solely to the banks of the Nile, but the truth is that they were tireless navigators and travelers. These peoples, often called Ethiopians by the ancients, established colonies, trade routes, and yes, centers of power that stretched throughout the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. They were a global force long before Rome existed. Just imagine, the Cushites were not merely neighbors, they were protagonists on the Middle Eastern stage, challenging our modern notion of national and racial boundaries. There is evidence in ancient texts describing the presence of Cushite ambassadors, merchants, and even military garrisons in Canaanite cities and the rich areas of Arabia. The history of the region is, in fact, a tapestry where the African thread is thick and vital. This presence was so significant that the Bible and other ancient texts mention, albeit subtly, the influence of these peoples on political structures and even military alliances. This proves that black sovereignty was not something exotic or temporary, but an established part of the balance of power in antiquity. To conceal this is simply to deny the complexity and interconnectedness of history. The Cushites brought to these lands not only their crown, but their advanced metallurgy, their irrigation techniques, and their profound stellar knowledge. They were masters of organization, and where they settled, order flourished. It was a cultural exchange that uplifted all involved, but which, ironically, ended up being swept under the rug of the official narrative. If these peoples were so important and influential, they must have left behind more than just legends and veiled descriptions. The most irrefutable proof of their passage and power must be kept in the very archives of the civilizations they influenced. Where would these secrets be? The next topic leads us to unearth the clay texts that reveal what has been hidden. The fertile soil of Mesopotamia is a vast archive, and among the thousands of cuneiform clay tablets discovered lie documents that official history has tried to silence, the true forbidden archives of antiquity. These are administrative reports, diplomatic letters, and most importantly, chronicles that narrate the arrival of a specific group of people who were not native to the region. The scribes describe them with reverence, calling them dark-skinned men from the East. These forgotten texts detail how these travelers brought with them more advanced irrigation systems, new accounting methods, and, in some cases, even improvements in writing itself. The description is not of invaders, but of masters. They came to organize the chaos, establish laws, and found cities where the local people lived in a more rudimentary way. It is a confession etched in clay of the East's intellectual debt to Africa. The question here is a stark one. If these tablets narrate that order and knowledge came with these dark-skinned men, why don't archaeology and academia place them at the center of the foundational narrative? The fear of dismantling the myth of a purely local civilization and the embarrassment of admitting an African origin for the very foundation of Western culture have forced silence about these discoveries. They were literally kept in boxes, far from the public eye. What these tablets prove is that the sovereignty of the Black Kings is not an invention, but a historical fact documented by those who lived through the cultural and political transition. This African royalty was not there to plunder, it was there to raise the level of civilization, acting as true instructors of the First Nations. They brought the concept of Ma'at, cosmic justice, to the heart of Mesopotamia. However, The introduction of new knowledge and new spiritual laws never happens without resistance. If these African kings brought their own gods and cults, this inevitably created a clash with the already established local deities and beliefs. What happened when the African and Eastern pantheons met, and who won this divine war? When the Black Kings arrived, they brought more than gold and writing. They brought their gods, their rituals, and a cosmic system that was radically different from what was practiced in the East. The introduction of African concepts such as the cosmic justice of Ma'at and the primacy of solar and resurrection gods, such as Ammonius and Osiris, generated immense spiritual tension with the local pantheons, which were often more focused on fear and chaos. It was a struggle for the soul of civilization. This dispute took place not only on the battlefield, but also in temples and in the hearts of the people, where local priests resisted the arrival of a faith from abroad, even though it brought order and prosperity. The conflict was over which divine lineage, African or Mesopotamian, would have ultimate authority over the destiny of humanity and over royalty itself. The crown was, after all, a gift from heaven. The result of this clash was a fascinating, yet tense, fusion, the so-called syncretism. Powerful African deities were not erased, they were absorbed, and their attributes were given to already existing Mesopotamian gods, as if the original power of the Nile were the secret source of strength for these new pantheons. This is why we find such striking parallels between the Egyptian sun god and some Eastern divine figures. The victory, at that moment, belonged to the African royalty, because the acceptance of their gods, even if disguised, meant the acceptance of their political and spiritual authority. They used religion as an unshakable foundation for their rule, ensuring that the throne was seen not only as a place of power, but as a sacred altar connected to African ancestry. But even with syncretism, the original and pure knowledge needed to be protected. Who were the guardians of this ancestral African wisdom? Those who ensured that the rituals were not lost in the confusion of the new cults. The next secret lies hidden behind the doors of the temples, where the African clergy kept the flame of truth alive. The true power of these Black Kings lay not only in the crown, but in the hands of the priests and priestesses who accompanied them, the true guardians of Africa's ancestral knowledge. They interpreted the stars, predicted river floods, and ensured that rituals were performed with the precision necessary to maintain cosmic balance and the sovereign's legitimacy. They were the living library of the empire. In the labyrinthine Eastern temples, far from the public eye, the African clergy maintained an esoteric knowledge, a secret cult of the serpent, where the snake was the symbol of eternity, hidden wisdom, and resurrection. This was the essence of Nilotic spirituality that they refused to see diluted in Mesopotamian syncretism. This secret knowledge, transmitted only orally, was the guarantee that, even in a foreign land, the soul of the empire would remain African. The priestesses, in particular, wielded immense power, controlling oracles and prophecies, advising kings on all important decisions, from war to harvest. They were viewed with fear and respect, as they were believed to be able to invoke the direct power of ancestors and African gods. The throne belonged to the king, but the secret to the empire's longevity lay in its wisdom. Over time, as the African royal lineage faced more resistance and local power grew, the wisdom of these priests became even more hidden, buried in codes and metaphors to protect it from persecution. They knew that the real battle was not for land, but for memory and the right to tell their own story. Knowledge literally became a hidden treasure. But what happens when these guardians are forced to silence and their influence is broken? How does history react to this loss? The next painful mystery shows us how the rise of new powers resulted in a systematic effort to erase this reign, rewriting the past with different ink. There comes a point in history when the truth becomes dangerous for those in power, and then erasure is put into practice. It is the time of the Great Distortion. With the decline of the Black lineage and the rise of empires like the Greek and Roman, and the consolidation of new religious narratives, it became essential to rewrite the past to justify the present. The history of African kingship needed to be erased. The method was subtle but cruel. The color and origin of these sovereigns were systematically changed. Dark-skinned kings became, overnight, light-skinned heroes, and their wisdom, which came from the Nile, was conveniently renamed Eastern or Semitic wisdom. Statues were remade, names were adapted, and Africa was downgraded on the map, going from a source of civilization to a continent of peripheral mysteries. Biblical narratives and Greek texts, in describing the origins of the Middle East, often omitted or minimized Cushite influence, transforming powerful sovereigns into minor figures or mere supporting characters. This act of denial was not an accident, you see. It was a political and spiritual strategy to delegitimize the original sovereignty and thus validate the new rule of the conquerors. This distortion created a hole in humanity's memory, leading us to accept the idea that the world's oldest and most complex civilization was the work of a single, isolated group, without profound influences from the global south. The erasure of African royalty was the first great crime in history, robbing not only a past, but the dignity of an entire continent. But no matter how much one tries to sweep the dust under the rug, not everything could be rewritten. If these kings brought laws and order, this wisdom must have been codified. There is an ancient law, famous throughout the world, that still holds the silent echoes of African principles of justice, revealing what they could not erase. The famous Code of Hammurabi, that set of laws that became the symbol of Mesopotamian social organization, may not be a purely local creation, but rather a legal legacy of the Black Kings. When comparing the structure of this code with the principles of justice and the legal codes of the Nubian kingdoms and Kemet, parallels emerge that are more than mere coincidences. They are echoes of the same source of wisdom. There is a deep concern for the protection of the most vulnerable, such as widows and orphans, and the idea that the law should maintain balance and social order, a concept that is the backbone of Ma'at, African cosmic justice. These principles of equity and royal responsibility, which were central in the Nile, reappear robustly at the heart of Babylonian law, suggesting a legal foundation originating from the south. What is most revealing is the emphasis on restitution and punishment based on social standing, something that echoes the careful hierarchy and moral rules that governed African empires. The Black Kings, upon arriving, not only imposed their gods but brought with them a complete legal system, proving that the cradle of law had deep roots in the administrative experience of Africa. It is clear, then, that the foundation of Mesopotamian social organization was established by an African worldview. Hammurabi, centuries later, was merely codifying principles that had been introduced and established by previous rulers whose lineages traced back to the land of Kush. Law, as well as religion, was a field where African influence undeniably took hold. If civil law was influenced, it's natural that knowledge of this royal lineage would have seeped into the religious texts that shaped the modern world. Where else did this ancestral African sovereignty hide? The next mystery lies within the pages of humanity's most widely read book, where a certain powerful hunter has surprising connections to the land of Kush. Even in the sacred texts that shaped Western thought, there are undeniable clues to this lost royal lineage, but they have been carefully ignored. The figure of Nimrod, the mighty hunter and founder of the cities of Babel, Erech, and Akkad, which are the heart of Mesopotamia, is described in the Bible with an origin that surprises and shocks the dominant historical narrative. He is explicitly linked to the land of Kush. Kush, for those who don't know, is how the Bible refers to the peoples who inhabited the region south of Egypt, that is, Nubia and ancestral Ethiopia, the heart of Black Africa. The sacred text unequivocally establishes an African lineage for the man credited as the builder and first great king of the Middle East, the founder of Babylon. This is a fact that changes everything. This connection is the most powerful proof that African sovereignty in the East is not a myth, but a historical foundation recognized even by the very peoples who rose up against it. Why, then, is this crucial passage about the origin of Nimrod rarely taught or emphasized? Because admitting that the cradle of Mesopotamian power and the founder of Babel have roots in Kush destroys the idea of white supremacy in ancient history. This African influence in the Bible doesn't stop with Nimrod, it extends to other passages that speak of powerful Cushite kings, military alliances, and a political force that everyone feared. The text confirms that the dark thread of power ran loose in the East, weaving history inextricably linked to Africa. If Nimrod, of African lineage, founded Babel, he certainly incorporated the knowledge and spirituality of his homeland into the very foundation of the city. What ancestral African wisdom was literally engraved in the stones and bricks of this legendary metropolis? The next mystery lies hidden in the sacred architecture of Babylon. The imposing Babylon, with its ziggurats reaching for the heavens and its blue brick gates, like the famous Ishtar Gate, hides within its very structure African wisdom. For these kings, architecture was not just brick upon brick, it was magic on a cosmic scale, and they applied the knowledge of stellar orientation that they had perfected on the Nile. The precision with which the temples and great watchtowers were aligned with specific constellations, or with the rising and setting of certain stars, directly echoes the techniques used in the construction of Meroe and Kemet. This architectural wisdom was, in fact, a ritual in itself, ensuring that the city was not only on Earth, but also connected to the flow and energy of the cosmos. By building Babylon with these sacred codes, the lineage of Nimrod was declaring that the city was an extension of African divine power, a gateway linking Mesopotamia directly to the heavens observed from the south. This ensured that the royal power established there was seen as unquestionable, a spiritual foundation that no invasion could shake. What is most fascinating is that this wisdom was slowly forgotten by successors, who inherited the buildings but not the key to their cosmic understanding. What remained was the shell of a great city, but the soul, that profound connection with the stars, remained a secret engraved in its blueprint. The city of Babel, after all, was an African prayer in stone. But what were the most intimate things these kings did to ensure their connection to the sacred was unbreakable? What was the secret ritual that transformed them from mortal leaders into demigods before their people? The next mystery leads us to an underground ceremony, the true secret of their ascension to the throne. For these kings of African lineage, sitting on the throne was not a mere political act. It was a profound spiritual experience, legitimized by a secret rite of passage known as the subterranean coronation. Far from the eyes of the people, in hidden chambers beneath temples or ziggurats, the sovereign underwent a ritual that connected him directly to the power of the Nile ancestors. Imagine the scene. The king descended into the darkness, where the silence was total and only torches guided his path, symbolizing the soul's journey to the underworld, like Osiris. He was purified and anointed with sacred oils, and there, in the bosom of the earth, he received the spirit of his African ancestors, transforming himself from a mortal man into a channel of the divine. It was the pinnacle of his sovereignty. This secret ritual was the non-negotiable key to the continued rule of the Black lineage, as it proved to all the local clans and priests that the king's authority came not only from the force of arms, but from a cosmic sanction. It was the final act of importing African power, the spiritual transfer of a crown born on the banks of the Nile to the plains of Mesopotamia. The fact that this ritual was kept in absolute secrecy reveals how vital and dangerous it was. If adversaries managed to steal the knowledge of this rite, they could claim the power of the ancestors and break the legitimacy of the Black lineage. It was a war fought on the spiritual plane to maintain dominance. But for this right to have its full power, it needed to be uttered in a specific language, with words of power that came from the original source, Africa. What was this sacred language that sealed the pact between the king and the ancestor, and why was it lost to time? The next mystery lies hidden in the sounds and words. Beneath the thousands of cuneiform symbols we know as Sumerian and Akkadian lies the substrate of an older language, a sacred tongue that was the key to the mysteries of the African lineage. It was not the language of the marketplace, but rather the language used in the highest rituals, the one that invoked ancestral power and sealed the fate of kings. It was the sonic proof of their origin. By analyzing the most archaic texts and the names of the first Mesopotamian gods and kings, it is possible to find words and grammatical structures that do not fit into the local language families, but which make perfect sense when compared to the Nilotic and Cushite languages. These are fragments of a dialect of power, which history tried to suppress, but which survived embedded in the vocabulary of kings and priests. This lost language was not merely a code for ceremonies. It contained the essence of African thought about the cosmos, mathematics, and medicine. What Mesopotamia called ancient knowledge was, in fact, the transposition of African concepts, whose meanings were only fully understood by those who spoke the original language. The power of the Black Kings was encoded in their speech. The African clergy clung to this language like a treasure, teaching it only to initiates, ensuring that the deepest knowledge remained inaccessible to rivals who sought to steal their crown and wisdom. They knew that as long as the language lived in secrecy, the ancestral connection would remain intact. But the wisdom of these peoples went beyond rituals and language. There was a group of wise men and travelers, the true philosophers of the time, who spread this knowledge throughout the East. Who were these magi, and how did they ensure that this heritage did not die with the fall of the throne? Even with the Black royalty facing challenges, the knowledge that came from Africa did not depend solely on the crown to survive. There was a powerful tradition of sages, astronomers, and philosophers, the so-called magi of the East, who were, in fact, heirs and disciples of African schools of wisdom. They were the guardians of the secret school of wisdom. These travelers, many of them from Kush or educated along the Nile, spread their sciences throughout Mesopotamia and beyond, influencing what would become the basis of Babylonian astrology and mathematics. They carried with them the secrets of sacred geometry and herbal medicine, ensuring that the intellectual advancement of the East drank directly from the African source. The term magi became synonymous with profound wisdom in the Middle East, but what was concealed was that the knowledge they professed was an adapted, yet still pure, version of African cosmology. The secret of this school was not about concealing the information itself, but about hiding its origin, so that the knowledge could survive even when the throne was no longer in the hands of the Black Kings. They were the cultural and intellectual mediators, ensuring that the foundation of Mesopotamian knowledge remained solid and sophisticated. Thanks to these wise men, African influence permeated philosophy and science so deeply that it became impossible to completely eradicate, even with all the historical distortion. However, the power of ideas cannot always overcome the force of arms. Despite all its wisdom and spiritual influence, the Black royal line met its political end. At what exact moment did this glorious dynasty definitively lose control over the Middle East, and what happened to its immediate legacy? Power does not last forever, and the glory of the African royal line in the Middle East began to fade with the relentless rise of new empires, more focused on military conquest than on ancestral wisdom. The moment of decline was gradual and silent, not a single event, but a slow political and cultural strangulation, where Cushite influence was slowly pushed out of the centers of power. As Mesopotamia became a battleground for rival empires, Assyrians, Chaldeans, and Persians, the Black lineage, already intermingled with the local elites, lost its spiritual appeal as founding kings. The new royalty needed a different, more aggressive narrative, and the peace and cosmic justice of Ma'at no longer served to justify power. And so, the desert sand settles, revealing the outlines of a story that pen and fire tried to destroy. The African prophets, whose names were silenced, did not lose the battle, they merely waited. Their legacy lies not in intact monuments or canonical texts, but in the very fiber of faith that governs millions of lives today. Africa, the mother of civilizations, is not only the cradle of humanity, but the spiritual source from which the water of life and law flowed. The touch of Ma'at, the knowledge of Jethro, the wealth of Cush, and the resilience of the Black Pharaohs are irrefutable proof that divine wisdom has no borders and is not limited to a single people. Feel the weight of this revelation. Honor the silence that guarded this truth for millennia. The past is not dead. It is a voice that whispers beneath the weight of official history, inviting us to recognize and respect the depth of forgotten knowledge. But the journey of truth never ends. There are more mysteries sleeping beneath the sand, waiting for the right moment to be revealed to the world. Don't miss the next secrets. Subscribe to this channel and activate notifications. Our pact with ancestral memory has only just begun.